Greetings and welcome on behalf of the Lumen Christi Institute. My name is Michael Le Chevalier and I serve as Associate Director here. Lumen Christi was founded in 1997 by Catholic scholars at the University of Chicago, and our mission is to make the Catholic intellectual tradition in its depth and breadth a living dialogue partner at the University of Chicago and in our broader society through courses, lectures, summer seminars for graduate and undergraduate students, and virtual events like these. I'm excited to share that today's event is part of a new initiative, the Catholic Criminal Justice Reform Network. I'll leave it to Tom, who is spearheading the initiative, to describe this in greater detail, but it exemplifies what Lumen Christi does best: draw widely and broadly from the community of Catholic scholars to draw deep from the wisdom of the Church, interfaced with the best of modern scholarship and applied to some of the most troubling issues, in this case, our broken criminal justice system. Our next event in the series will take place on April 8th, The Origins of Mass Incarceration, the Courts in the 1960s Criminal Procedure Revolution, featuring Judge Stefanos Bibas of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit and William Peasy, Professor Emeritus of University of Colorado Law School. Speaking of other troubled American institutions, you can also join us on March 20th for a conversation between the great Catholic philosopher Charles Taylor, Patricia Nans, and Jason Blakely on fragile democracy, technocratic takeover, and popular renewal. You'll find links to register for both of these within the chat. Today's event will be recorded and posted on YouTube. I encourage you to share it with colleagues and friends who are unable to participate today. Now, today's event wouldn't be possible without a number of co-sponsors: the Catholic Lawyers Guild of Chicago, the Boston College Law School, the University of St. Thomas School of Law, Colby House Jail Ministry, St. Paul's Catholic University Center, the Collegium Institute's Legal Humanities Project, the National Center for the Laity, American Media, and Oxford University Press. I'm grateful to these many institutions that have helped ensure the success of today's event. Now, you too can help support us in 3 different ways. You can join our mailing list and share word about these events with others. Word of mouth, even during quarantines and a pandemic, remain the best way and most effective means of inviting others to engage with the Catholic intellectual tradition. At the end of the event, you'll be invited to participate in a survey that will help us gauge what we're doing right and how we could improve. Filling it out, you'll also enter in for a raffle to win a gift card to our favorite local independent bookstore, the Seminary Co-op. And finally, you can support us financially by donating today at www.lumenchristi.org/donate. A gift of any kind goes a long way to helping us to continue to provide great programming like this for free to viewers like you. At the end of the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. You can, however, post a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and Judge Tom Donnelly at the end will be reading these questions. Now, I now have the pleasure of introducing today's moderator and getting the show on the road. The Honorable Thomas Moore Donnelly serves as an Associate Judge of the Circuit Court of Cook County. Sworn in as a judge in 2000, he currently serves in the Law Division Trial Section. He has tried over 300 jury trials. He has also taught at Loyola Law School for the past 30 years. He's a close friend and collaborator of the Institute, most recently spearheading these efforts to form a Catholic Criminal Justice Reform Network. Tom, I invite you to unmute yourself and turn on your screen.
Thank you, Michael. This is an exciting night. It marks the inaugural event for the Catholic Criminal Justice Network. And this Catholic Criminal Justice Reform Network is sponsored by the Lumen Christi Institute as part of its program on Catholic social thought. And it's also sponsored by many Catholic law schools and universities. The network connects scholars, lawyers, clergy, and others who share the common goal of criminal justice reform. It will act as an incubator where distinctively Catholic thought about criminal justice is developed and from which it will spread to the wider culture. It will encourage the introduction of Catholic social teaching regarding criminal justice into law schools, colleges, and universities. And finally, it will develop policy solutions that reflect the Catholic tradition and transcend partisan division. Tonight marks the first of a series of regular virtual events open to the public that will occur in 2021 and 2022 on this topic of Catholic criminal justice reform. In the works are also 2 in-person meetings in Seattle and Washington, D.C. for fall 2021 and spring 2022. This network brings together scholars from across political and ideological affiliations who share a common commitment to the inviolable dignity of the human person, and especially to the marginalized. The network, however, includes not only scholars, but judges, lawyers, clergy, police commissioners, the formerly incarcerated, victims, jail chaplains, and social activists. And while rooted in Catholic teaching, the network is ecumenical. It includes Protestant and Jewish scholars, as well as scholars with a deep spiritual commitment to human dignity. Now I move on to introduce our speakers. Andrew Skotnicki is professor in theological and criminological ethics at Manhattan College in New York City. He received an undergraduate degree in history from Marquette University, an MA in ecclesiastical history from Washington Theological Union, and a PhD in religion and society from the Graduate Theological Union. He has published numerous essays on the theological and ethical implications of criminal justice, as well as 4 books, the latest of which we talk about tonight: Conversion and the Rehabilitation of the Penal System, a theological rereading of criminal justice, Oxford 2019. And I urge you to buy a copy of this book. It is a wonderful and very exciting piece of literature. It was the recipient of the 2019 Aldersgate Prize, and his latest volume under consideration, not yet published, is The Prophets Are Crazy: Injustice, Insight, Insanity, Incarceration, and it is under review for Bristol University Press. Andrew has spent years in the jails and prisons of America, not, however, as an inmate, but as chaplain, including 9 years here in Cook County as a chaplain in our Cook County Jail. For the past 9 years, he has taught an accredited college course in the jails of New York City. Over 70 of the confined students who have completed the course have received tuition-free classes at Manhattan College. And there's a wonderful TED Talk he has, which is available on YouTube, and I suggest you check it out. It is a stunning TED Talk. Cecelia Klingele is an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin Law School, where she teaches courses in criminal law, constitutional criminal procedure, policing, sentencing, and corrections. She is also a faculty associate of the Frank J. Remington Center, the La Follette School of Public Affairs, and the Institute for Research on Poverty. Professor Klingele's academic research focuses on criminal justice administration with an emphasis on community and institutional corrections. She has served as an associate reporter of the American Law Institute's Model Penal Code, sentencing revision, external co-director of the University of Minnesota's Robina Institute's Sentencing Law and Policy Program, and co-chair of the Academic Committee of the American Bar Association's Criminal Justice Section. After receiving her JD from the University of Wisconsin Law School in 2005, Professor Klingele served as law clerk to Chief Judge Barbara B. Crabb of the United States District Court for the Western District of Wisconsin, Judge Susan H. Black of the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, and last but not least, she served as law clerk to Associate Justice John Paul Stevens of the United States Supreme Court. She returned to the University of Wisconsin in 2009 as a visiting assistant professor and has been a permanent faculty member since 2011. And I asked Professor Klingele and Professor Skotnicki to unmute themselves and show themselves. Andrew, how would you explain, can conversion rehabilitate the penal system?
I think we talk about conversion, first of all, Tom, you got to say that we have to be converted to something, from something and to something. And so I'm not talking about conversion because it's a very oft used phrase. It's used in the sciences, both the hard sciences and social sciences. It's used in many religious conversations. But when I speak about conversion, I'm talking about not necessarily the change from unbelief to belief or from one religious tradition to another. I'm talking about conversion as a fundamental shift from isolation to communion, one from alienation to participation, one from fear to trust and hope, one from local or tribal allegiance to universal benevolence. Conversion is a move from any form of violence to explicit and unlimited compassion and forgiveness. So when I talk about those things, you say, well, that's not our criminal justice system. And that's specifically why I wrote the book. Well, actually, I've written all my books and why I have spent so much time in our penal system, because I've seen so much needless slaughter of innocence. December 28th has nothing on what we've done to endless human beings. Crushed in a system, may I say, primary responsibility is the Catholic Church. Our whole turn to legality in the Middle Ages, the first time in which people came into contact with God through contact with law. But to bracket that conversation for a moment, and I hope we can return to it, conversion will rehabilitate the penal system because nobody learns anything from being harmed. One of the problems we have had throughout penal history, and again, I point the finger at our church, we want to do everything. We want to be protected, let's be honest. We want a criminal justice system that stops them, right, from doing any kind of antisocial acts or any kind of acts that we suspect they may permit. That's the problem with incapacitation. You know, you're locking up somebody not because of what they did, but because of what they think they might do. And what we lock up are delinquents. We lock up the poor. We lock up so many people who are marginal to our society. And so when I think about conversion, I'm thinking about a movement where we need to move from seeing people as threats or delinquents, but realizing that the problem in our criminal justice system is that we don't recognize the humanity, the dignity, the beauty, the sameness, the internal ontological link that we have with them. And so what we do is we inflict pain. But as I say, the history of criminal justice is you can't make somebody better by harming them. You cannot will violence on somebody and at the same time wish that they would stop the actions that they had or somehow become more sociable or better people. And so the criminal justice system is a prolonged exercise in not just the futility, but needless violence, needless dualism, needless denigration of entire populations of people over 1,000 years, certainly since the beginning of retributivism in the West with the birth of canon law, and we can talk about that later. But that's the only way to rehabilitate the criminal justice system is to realize that the only way people become better is by participation, by understanding, by conversation, by dialogue, by forgiveness. These are all gospel values. The charisma of the gospel and the teachings of Jesus Christ is exactly about conversion. Everything that our Lord did was to call people to participation. Remember the rich young man, you got everything? No, you don't. Follow me. Leave behind and follow me. It's always follow in the footsteps of our Lord. And so conversion rehabilitates the penal system when we recognize that there is no ontological difference between me and everyone else, that all of us are lodged in fear, that all of us are alienated, that all of us are tribal, that all of us can resort to violence, that there's no one better than anyone else, that we're all heroes and villains. And the only way to rehabilitate the criminal justice system is to begin with really where we began with our penitential and monastic systems at the dawn of the Christian era, when we realized that no one has to be harmed. We carry within us an internal reservoir of compassion, of goodness, of longing for communion and participation. And the only thing we need to do in a criminal justice system is to create the conditions for people to understand how much they are alienated, how much they are lonely, how much they're suffering. And suffering is always internal. The needless exhibition and application of suffering by the state doesn't allow the natural ability of a human being to say, I am lonely, I am scared, I'm isolated, I'm alienated, and I long as a social being to be a part of this, of a wider body of care. And so it's a babbling answer, Tom, in a way, but I didn't know what you were going to ask. But I hope at least I got the conversation going. There's nothing that is gained by hurting another human being. We're all called to be converted. And the jail system and the prison system would almost shut down if we really believed the dignity of human beings. And for those who had to be incarcerated, then we allowed them the time and the space for their natural sociability, their natural sense of pain, for being delinquent and being isolated and alienated from the human community, to allow that to germinate and grow and allow the fundamental goodness that resides in every human heart to blossom and to express itself.
You're muted, Judge.
I'm going to switch over to Cecelia and ask her, you have written that acknowledging the breadth of violence inflicted by the criminal justice system is an essential prerequisite to properly understanding the role of violence in the criminal justice system. And that appears deeply resonant with what Andrew has talked about this evening. It appears you too believe that the penal system, indeed the entire criminal justice system, needs a conversion experience. While you seem to agree about the nature of the problem, do you agree with his proposed solution?
Great question. And let me back up and say, it's not just the criminal justice system that needs conversion. We all do. I think Andrew and I would agree, and I think many would, that we fundamentally need, as humans in the criminal justice system, outside the criminal justice system, to recognize our own guilt, our own need for transformation, for conversion. And that many of the problems we see within the criminal justice system are really reflections of the deficits of our larger communities, the breakdown of relationship, of communities of care and support and concern. It's easy to blame those within the criminal justice system, both those subject to it and those who operate it, and say that the violence that we see there is a result of errors in criminal justice, when so oftentimes they are simply the fallout from deficits that we all are responsible for in the ways we fail to support and love and care about our brothers and sisters throughout their lifespan and in all of the conditions in which they find themselves. So I would agree with many, many parts of this book. Certainly that criminal sanctions should seek to do no harm. And in this context, I would define harm as suffering inflicted for its own sake, for the sake of causing agony or suffering in the other person, which is distinctive from imposing some kind of sanction that is received as involuntary, undesirable, and unpleasant for an agreed upon purpose that will advance communal interests and private interests. And we can talk about, I think we're going to talk about that more in a little bit. I would also agree that criminal sanctions should never stand in the way of or impose a burden on people's ability to grow as humans, to thrive, to be recognized with dignity and respect, to develop full and meaningful relationships, to stay connected to communities, to develop communities within prisons, and to connect with communities of origin as well. Our system owes it to those for whom we are responsible when we involuntarily detain them to model and mirror the kind of human behavior that we wish to see. And as Andrew's book enumerates, and as the criminal justice system describes daily, we fail. We fail in that frequently by resorting and reverting to an us versus them mentality. By seeing people as other, we allow our pride and anger to find force and justification in behaviors that demean and diminish the dignity of the people who have been entrusted to the care of those who do operate the criminal justice system. And I would agree that that itself is a profound injustice that can't be covered by the fact that someone has been found guilty of having committed a crime, however egregious.
Now, Andrew, you make the point that human beings should not be free to do harm, but neither should their freedoms be constrained for the purpose of punishing them. And it seems to me that's somewhat of a distinction without a difference. You are saying we're going to incarcerate you, but we're not doing it with the purpose of punishing you. We're just keeping you here. And I would think that many of the folks that I have sentenced to terms of imprisonment would say, that's a little bit of a wordplay. You can't be serious. So what's your response to that question of whether there's really any difference between punishing somebody by incapacitating them or just incapacitating them without the purpose of punishment?
Well, thanks, Tom. It's a very good point. Let me expand the conversation just a bit. I not only don't believe in punishment, I basically don't believe in imprisonment. I think as Catholics, those are the two things that we need to make, a move we need to make in our compendium and our catechism. It took us 2,000 years to give up stating any justification for torture or capital punishment. That's a shameful thing to say. I'm always reminded of that quote in Legitimation Crisis by Habermas, is that an institution is in deep, deep danger when the current members of that institution have lost contact with its formative vision. That's when you have a legitimation crisis. We have a legitimation crisis, as far as I'm concerned, in the church. And that is that we have underwritten a system of violent persecution, dating back to Anselm, Abelard, Aquinas, the entire legal revolution that began with Gregory VII. We poisoned the waters of the legal system at their very inception. My idea is we can't take back all the harm we have done as a church, for we have underwritten the retributivism in the West. So my point, Tom, kind of roundabout to get to your question, is I'm saying that virtually no one should go to prison. If we really followed our belief in conversion, that everybody is ontologically good, they don't need to be punished, they suffer, they punish themselves. If we treated everybody as you said so beautifully, Cecelia, to will nothing but harm, no harm on no one, that I need to be converted, that anybody who can sit in a judicial chair and end someone's life and functionally their lives are ended. No offense, Tom. Their lives are ended. No offense to our prosecutors. You have inherited a tradition, and you are the heirs of a very unfortunate mistake in Catholic history. To believe that we can leave the gospel aside. I love that line by Remy Bragg, and he says, only in the Middle Ages did people ever come into contact with God through the law. Before our first 1,000 years of history, we were more of an evangelical church. We believed in relationality. Nobody went to prison in the first millennium. Why? Because people didn't need to be treated violently. Our whole penitential system was rooted in relationship. Now I want to get back to your point, Tom, is that the only people who should ever be locked up are those who are so malignantly dangerous, who wake up, I think of Psalm 36, who plot the destruction of goodness as they lie on their beds. People who are wantonly cruel. People for whom another human life means nothing and they'd be willing to kill them. What percentage of the people that we have locked up in America today? 12 million people go to jail every year. 12 million go to jail in every year. We have 2 other million people locked up in our prisons. As far as I'm concerned, as a Catholic Church, we should abolish the whole mess. The only thing we need to look at are those precise people who, again, are so dangerous to themselves, who have so alienated that a human life means nothing to them. So those, Tom, I'm arguing you don't punish them. You don't have to punish them, because a converted person always moves from alienation to participation, from any sort of sense of vindictiveness or anger to forgiveness. And so the movement we need as a church is to say none but the most dangerous ever need to be locked up, and no one needs to be harmed. There's a huge difference, and Cecelia and Tom, you know it better than I do. The entire system is built, including the Catholic Church. What's the very first thing it says in the Catechism, 2266? Punishment imposed by legitimate public authority has the aim of redressing disorder caused by the offense. No word of the gospel. The compendium. In order to protect the common good, the lawful public authority must exercise the right and duty to inflict punishments. Even Aquinas says punishment is pain. So I don't believe that. I think there is a massive difference, Don, massive difference between the kind of, and I've been in many courtrooms, and the kind of public recrimination, denunciation, and defacing of a human being by saying the most horrific things about them and then willing them to suffer. Tom, I think there's every difference in the world than to say, you're my child, you're a member of us, and you've alienated yourself very badly, and you're hurting, and I know you're hurting. And we're gonna take you away for your good. Just like Tom and Cecelia, you put your kid in the bedroom and say, you hit your little sister. Now you've done it 3 different times. I love you, baby, but you ain't coming out until you come and you apologize to your sister, right or wrong, guys. If we followed the gospel, we'd always have that family model. Am I babbling, Tom?
Well, Cecelia, does Andrew go too far?
So as I was reading the book, and I have the same feeling, again, listening to you, Andrew, I think, wow, you must be a much nicer parent than I am. Maybe it's because I have so many children and punishment is sort of part of my day, that I think punishment can coexist with love. And it is true that the interior disposition of the punisher matters. But I guess my reaction, again, is not to deny in any way the inherent goodness of the person, right? All made in the image and likeness of God, no matter what life has done to the person or the person has done in her life. And yet, I think that the history of criminal justice is one in which our human attempts to embrace healing of a kind that maybe can't fully happen in this life for some people has been one of abuse, we're not very good at fixing people, or in this case, and I know the book, condemns the wrongs of rehabilitation gone awry. And yet there were many places in which I felt that conversion was subject to many of the same kinds of potentials for abuse. And in fact, historically, it has been. If we look outside the criminal justice system and look at the history of conversion, whether within the monastery or convent or in a home, harsh enforced penances have been forms of torture and abuse for many people, imposed by people, maybe even well-intentioned, in the name of fostering good. And so it is not that I don't think we must leave space for love, and that those who work in the system ought not to spend a tremendous amount of time reflecting on the fact that, they not only there, but for the grace of God go I, but in fact, we do daily all fail in loving our neighbor. We do harm to others in ways that are serious, more serious than we usually want to acknowledge. That we are one and the same with our brothers and sisters who have been convicted and punished. And I think, I guess, in line with C.S. Lewis, I think that there is a dignity and a respect for human free choice that goes along with holding people accountable in a way that is proportional to their culpability through formally imposed punishment, and that respects both their dignity and autonomy, and simultaneously limits our ability to hurt them. And I kept throughout the book thinking, where is the limiting principle? Where does it stop? Because just as the indeterminate sentence was the chief tool of rehabilitation and resulted in endless abuses, right? Indefinite detention until people were cured, when perhaps all they'd done was, to take the old example, stolen a loaf of bread. What is our limiting principle when people have done, they have sinned, they have wronged, they have committed a crime against the civil community? How do we constrain ourselves? Because holding them until they are converted may not be realistic or fair, right? It may be disproportionate and unjust. And in those cases, I think that the proportional punishment is actually a sign of respect and constraint.
So Andrew, I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
Sure. Well, here's my point again, guys, is I'm an abolitionist, and I think we should be as a church. So I want to go back to that again. So as I say, no offense, but Tom, so you'd probably be out of business if I had my way. We'd get you a job. We'd relocate you. It's like soldiers, you know what I mean? We'll get you a different profession, you know what I mean, in which you can make a decent income. I want to go back to the evangelical roots of our faith. That's the glaring lacuna to me in Catholic social teaching. Really, until Francis, we saw a little bit of that with John Paul, God may he rest in peace. He was the first one who really, through a phenomenological perspective and in his own evangelical faith, and I mean that in the most wonderful way. I consider myself a Catholic evangelical. It's all got to be about the gospel for me, at least try to be. And so I want to say back to this, Cecelia, that for the first 1,000 years, we didn't have any prisons. Why? Not because people were any better than they are now, because we had a moral community of people who believed in one another. One of your favorite professors, Tom, James Whitman, The Origins of Reasonable Doubt. I'm sure you read it, Cecelia. His argument on reasonable doubt is it is nothing to do with the determination of a jury as to whether somebody is or isn't fit for punishment. It's all about, dare I bring harm upon another human being? And the whole medieval church prior to the legal revolution, and it's a dark period in Catholic history as far as I'm concerned. But prior to that, no one would rat out anyone else because they thought they took Jesus for his word. Who are you to condemn another when I have forgiven you? So I'm going to go to your point, Cecelia, is that we didn't need to inflict pain. You never need to inflict pain to make people better. I don't know where as a church, I do know where as a church, we lost the evangelical sense of participation, forgiveness, tutoring, prayer techniques. I don't know where we lost all that, that we feel the only thing left, if you want to call the only limiting principle, is a spoonful of pain. And so I'm saying only those who wantonly want to destroy other human beings, serial killers, people who feel nothing at human remorse, sadists. As I say in old school theology, the only people who should be in prison are the damned, what we would consider, and they should be loved, the chains removed from them with patient accompany. Now, Cecelia, how long will it take from somebody who has no absolute respect for human life to ever reach a point where he or she could reach what she's ontologically fit to do, and that is to see the face of God in everyone? At what point do they reach? Now, they're not going to get there because I'm not going to get there, but they can wake up in the morning and say, I don't want to kill anybody anymore. Now, how long does that take? And what I argue, Cecelia, is that if you are a patient person working in a restricted, limiting atmosphere, such as a prison like the Umaita prison that I mentioned in the book, that was the inspiration for faith-based prisons, you can't fake a lack of care for others. Or better, you can't fake care for others. You can't go on for years and not show in some demonstrative way that your natural sociability has somehow broken through all the incrustation of hatred and remorse and bitter memories and violence done to you and horrible injustices. Everybody's capable of being converted. So few need to go to prison, though, that I would make the bet anyway, Cecelia, that a loving accompaniment of someone who's done something terrible is precisely the only way you can turn someone for whom human life means nothing to someone who can begin to cherish human life, at least at a level commensurate with what we expect from our citizenry. So I understand the question. Yes, it's the same problem they had when rehabilitation fell into favor with the indeterminate sentence. But again, that was a whole different way of understanding. That's a we, they, that's a division of subject and object and act and human, which are act and person, that are so much a part of our legal network in which we have so much duality. I'm just saying that we can reach a point, I think, through the kind of accompaniment I'm speaking with, that you can understand who a human being is and know when he or she is willing, should be let back into the human community. I'd be willing to take that bet because so few people need to go to prison in the first place.
I'm going to switch over to Cecelia. One of Andrew's targets in his book is not only retribution, but also the sort of utilitarian theory of punishment that Jeremy Bentham came up with, and that is really the gospel for American corrections. It is the manipulation of people to make them better by altering their behavior, but not attempting any conversion of the heart. What's your response to his critique?
Well, I think that it's a longstanding critique, and part of the resurgence in the 1980s and 90s in a focus on retributivism was in reaction to abuses of the rehabilitative model, right? I think that there are many strains, right? And Andrew acknowledges this in his book when you talk about any utilitarian aim, but I want to focus particularly on rehabilitation because I think deterrence theory has been roundly criticized, and it has been shown pretty clearly, I think, that punishment is a tiny little sliver of deterrence anyway. So looking at rehabilitation in particular, there are multiple strands that run through it and through the literature. There is, I think, this deeper, what I like to call humanitarian rehabilitationism that focuses on the importance of providing opportunities and services, education, maybe vocational training, though that's a little more instrumental, opportunities for personal psychotherapy, trauma-based interventions that are designed really to just respect the dignity of people and attempts to give them an opportunity to grow and restore and heal. Mindfulness, which Andrew commends so heavily in the book, right, has become a really popular kind of course or program in a lot of institutions and in community supervision as well, because I don't want to ignore the largest section of the correctional population, which is the community corrections population. So there is a humanitarian thread that is very consistent with this idea of conversion, helping people develop relationships, mentoring opportunities, particularly peer mentors and peer models, people with lived experience who are there to support and guide those still involved in the system. And I think those are very consonant with the kind of conversion that Andrew, you're promoting. At the same time, there is this second thread, which seems to be growing in prevalence, this what I kind of a scientific rehabilitationism is sort of what I've called it in the past, that really does treat people as widgets. And if you just press buttons A and C, then you will get outcome Y, which is always a statistically relevant reduction in recidivism, right? That's what everyone is looking for. And I have often found it frustrating, and have written to this effect, that we seem to think we just need the right magic formula to make human beings do all the things we want them to do and to predict their futures more accurately. And I think this is where the idea of people as ensouled creation, right, in relationship with others, is so key. People are not widgets, and there is no one right model. And Andrew, I really appreciated your attention to the individualization and honoring the individual journey, the importance of accompaniment here in giving people space to change. I think it's also really consistent, quite frankly, with the research literature, which seems to suggest that what is effective in changing people's behavior isn't a program model. It's the intensity and depth of their relationship with people who are running programs, right? Or who they get to know. It's in the life course criminology, right? It's the opportunity to change your narrative. It's getting married, it's falling in love, it's having a child. It's all of the meaningful, really kind of sacramental with a small s moments that allow us to change our relationship to God and to others. And again, I think it's really essential here. And what I took away, Andrew, mostly from your book is the importance of our system not getting in the way of those human experiences, not adding to the deprivation of those in our system, but rather finding ways to facilitate all of the natural goods that give us joy and help us remain connected to the good and to thrive.
So Andrew, I want to again push you on a distinction you make and ask you to explain it to me, because you believe that it's wrong to punish anyone for any reason, which is a bold statement. You make the distinction between punishment and penalties. And again, I'm hard pressed to see what difference there might be. So you distinguish punishment from penalties, e.g. a parking ticket. And while they need not result in hard treatment, the prescribed action must be at least addressed by a form of public denunciation, a disapproval and reprobation. But that's not punishment because we're not intending it to be punishment. Again, what is the difference?
Oh no, I don't believe in any of that. It's both, you're quoting Joel Feinberg.
All right.
And I know, I mean, he's a pretty mild retributivist. Oh no, I don't believe in any of that. Oh, I'm not nothing against parking tickets, Tom.
So you're okay, but you're okay with.
I don't mind people getting a parking ticket. I paid my.
You're okay with penalty.
Oh, no, I don't agree with any of that. I agree. I think Cecelia should run the Federal Bureau of Prisons, is what I think.
How about no?
Because Cecelia, you're so rare. You know, you said it so beautifully. I'm gonna come back to you, Tom, but
I believe in punishment, Andrew. In fact, I'll probably punish 3 more people before the night's out.
None of us are converted, though, and that's the beautiful thing, Cecelia. I told myself every morning I'm not gonna yell at my wife, and sometimes I make it to 10 o'clock at night, and pow, and I spend the whole night feeling bad, and or even getting mad at anyone. But the point is, I know who I am, and I know what I'm called to, and nobody punishes me more than me. You know, my wife doesn't have to throw the furniture or the silverware at me anymore. You know, but she never had to, because when I'm unkind, I'm so sad, and I'm so lonely, and I miss God so much because I know the Spirit is not in me then. So anyway, I besides that little, you know, rhetorical prayerful point, I just don't think that we need to punish people. Don't need to punish people. And again, I don't know how we're going to be able to the wonderful points that Cecelia and you are making is we're not going to be converted overnight. We're not going to give up our violence. We're not going to give up our prejudices. My problem with rehabilitation isn't just, as you say, it's become so technical and it's been so instrumental in getting them to make us feel better, because who really cares about the people in jail and prison? All we want to do is don't steal my car, you know, and don't mug me in a dark alley. We have no intellectual sense as a system to care, because we all know most of the people we lock up are the people we don't like anyhow. We have a model of what a delinquent is, and let's face it, it's a poorer, darker portrait of what a delinquent is, and happens to be in the certain parts of our city, because we know, like in here in New York, 92% of the jail population is Black and Hispanic. So we already know who we say, quote, need to be rehabilitated. They don't need to be rehabilitated. We do. And so I guess my point is, it's coming to an official recognition as a church. We're never going to do this as a society. But I want us as a church to say it's wrong. It's wrong to punish, because Christ would not will us to punish anyone. Because Christ forgave everyone. Because Christ loved everyone, and we should too. And there is no justification for saying Jesus is wrong. And I want the church to go back to Christ and go back to its first millennium of understanding that everything can be accomplished without any forms of violence, at least officially. Now, what happens in a household, or what happens in a specific court, or what happens, as you mentioned earlier, a sadistic habit, or you know what I mean, a wayward priest, you know, who will do something to bring shame upon herself or himself and upon the church. But as an official body, I've given up hope, you know, that America is going to become a kind and loving nation. I don't believe in America. I believe in the gospel, and I believe in our church. And I think that's where I want us to go, is to say, okay, we may not be able to do it as a society, but as a church, we're putting our nickel down right here. Stop hurting people. They don't need, they're already hurting. Love them, forgive them, integrate them, create community corrections, create informal means of mediation, create restitution programs. Oh, we got so much brilliant people, so many brilliant people, and so much goodwill that we could divert 99% of the entire jail and prison population. And as I say, leave it to the serial killers and the people who want to plant a nuclear bomb in Times Square. But we can work with them too. But those are the only ones we need to lock up, I think.
Well, I'm going to come back to Cecilia's earlier point, because Professor Dean Strang from Loyola, and I'm going to start asking some of the questions we've gotten from the viewers, and I urge people to put their questions in the chat, and I will try to get to as many of them as possible tonight. So Professor Dean Strang, again, comes back to the point Cecelia raised. Who could morally be incarcerated? And do you believe there's a moral limit on the time of incarceration, extrinsic to the inmate's own growth in sociability? So what is the limiting principle for those, your hardcore folks, who you think should be incapacitated?
Is that for Cecelia or myself? I'm sorry.
That's for you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, again, Judge, thank you very much. And Cecelia really asked the question very well. You know, I write in the book, and I'm so happy to say I'm working on essentially a meta-ethical critique. And what I'm saying is it's the language that we use to talk about other human beings that needs to be changed. The language of the courtroom, the language of the way in which we depict who are the criminals and who are the law-abiding. I find the entire language so riddled with dualism, with divisions, with false negatives about who is a worthy person, who can live with us sociably, and who should be relegated to a dungeon. So I'm arguing that fundamentally at a meta-ethical level, we need to broaden our conversation. We won't do it as a nation, but I want us to do it at least as a church. Now, at that point, I'm arguing that we didn't have to punish people. Prisons never really showed up in any formal way until Boniface VIII, at the end of the 14th century, said that there should be an ecclesiastical prison in every diocese. We didn't have any formal prisons as we know them today until the beginning of the 19th century. For so many years, we found ways through fines, through restitution. In the early church, there were pilgrimages. We found so many non-violent ways to deal with human error and human fallibility, and we're all fallible. Nobody's better than anybody. I love Augustine's line, between God and the devil, there's only two kinds of people, the good but not very good, and the bad but not very bad. It makes us all equal. And so again, Professor, I guess, I know I get a little, you can tell my professor, I get all wound up, but I'm just saying that so few people really need to go to prison. Only those who are the most dangerous, lethally dangerous. And I would say for them that we accompany them, we love them, we care for them, we respond, we give them the same kind of care we would give to any human being, regardless of what they've done. None of us is good, all right? None of us, like Jesus says, why do you call me good? There is no one good but God alone. And so I say you accompany them, and I believe Professor, and I know, after you spend a long time with somebody, you know who they are. You can look in their eyes and see the light of Christ shining. And if it's still malevolence, unfortunately, that's where Cecelia tried to put me in a good point of saying, you're just another, old-fashioned rehabilitationist, lock them up until we say they're better. But I believe that there's, again, a fundamental core of goodness in the human heart. And we can communicate at a level that we need not extend punishment any later than somebody who has discovered his or her natural sociability.
So Cecelia, here's a question I think that really is properly addressed to you, sort of focusing on the objectification of offenders. How are sentencing algorithms and the emergency of AI-assisted sentencing consultations now or in the near future likely to affect practices in sentencing, pardoning, and parole actions?
Big question with a lot to say. I'll try to keep it really brief, though, for this context. There are many emerging questions about new algorithmic tools that seek to predict people's aggregate statistical risk of criminal reoffense. Some of these tools use defined algorithms that are publicly available. Some are proprietary and held closely by businesses that profit off their sale. And the newest are what we call black boxes, which really rely heavily on artificial intelligence to decide what factors are relevant. And often it is inscrutable to the human operators of these programs how such predictions are being made. Each of those poses a different kind of legal, ethical, and moral risk and threat. But here is what I would say is relevant to our conversation today. It goes back largely, I think, to the conversation we were having about the utilitarian aims of punishment and the role that they should or shouldn't rightly play in criminal sanctioning. If what we're worried about is future risk of harm and present risk of harm, we might want to think about how dangerous an allegedly dangerous person is, right? And in doing so, humans in the main over-predict risk. We're risk-averse creatures. And as a result, sometimes these tools can be used in ways that check our natural biases and help remind us that, in fact, most people are happily less risky than we think they are. That is what I see as a positive and good use of a risk prediction tool. At the same time, risk is often, I think, irrelevant to most decisions being made. And fundamentally, and here we sort of come back to the whole retribution, punishment, desert question. I think that oftentimes, if we let our fear of what someone might do in the future lead, we forget about perhaps the very small amount of punishment that might be deserved for the past offense. And we end up punishing more rather than less if we let those concerns about the what ifs of the future take over for us. And I think that if we are going to be centered in the person, we have to remember that we have historically justified punishment not by risk of what someone might or might not do, but rather by the actual moral choices that have been actually made in the past and the moral culpability that attaches to those choices. And so I think it's really important that when we think about this as Catholics in particular, we remember that it is moral desert that has historically justified and cabined the exercise of state power over people. I think, Andrew, every time I hear you talk, I think, wow, you have so much more hope maybe than I do. Like your virtue is just like overflowing with hope. And I think I'm a lot more skeptical of state power and its historic and present abuses. And my tendency is to want to constrain people's ability to exercise authority over others. And I think that desert can be a limiting principle that way.
We've got a question for Andrew. Didn't people encounter God through law long before the Middle Ages, namely in the Torah?
Oh, that I was speaking of the Catholic Church. I'm sorry for the writer. Absolutely.
All right. Well, then I'll follow.
We don't, but as I said, Sharia law and Torah. There's a big. That's what we have to get into Paul and Jesus and all the problems he got with legalists.
Well,
so, no, I meant that in the Catholic Church.
Well, speaking of Jesus,
but thank you for the question, because you're absolutely right.
Speaking of Jesus, Nicolene and Tom Shields asked, today's gospel at Mass is about Lazarus and the rich man who ends up in hell. How can you reconcile no punishment with that gospel story?
Well, as you may or may not know, the story is actually Egyptian, and it was commonly told in the ancient world, and Jesus picked up on it. And it was actually the original story was of, I believe, as a professor and a student, and the professor belittled the student repeatedly. And again, you can read commentaries on this. But what happened is that person ends up going into perdition. Jesus changes the entire thing to the beggar, to the Lazarus, to the person who is fighting with the dogs for the crumbs that fill off the rich people's table. And of course, we have that Jesus does not change the idea of telling the story about the person in flames. Now, what is the metaphor of flames? Again, we can go. I'm not an exegete, but I read the gospel, and again, it's a beautiful question. It's a wonderful story, and I read it today this morning, and thought of all the people lying in rags here in New York City, sleeping in subways, and an unprecedented number of poor people, at least in this town. I don't know about the one you live in, but as I read the gospel, I feel ashamed. I don't feel like Jesus is saying, I'm going to go to hell. I think Jesus is saying you're already in hell. And I'm a firm believer of that. I don't think there's anything in our Catholic teaching, and for that matter, anything really in Jesus' teaching. I think of Matthew 25. We love talking about who's Jesus going to send to hell. Nobody gets sent to hell. Nations get sent to hell. Churches get sent to hell. It's a judgment on societies. We're going to go to hell. We should go to hell. For how we treat people. So again, forgive me. I'm not angry. I get a little excited about this kind of stuff. But I think it's you live in heaven and you live in hell right now. This is where Christ is. Right? And if I'm alienated from Jesus Christ, I am in hell. Let's take the flames, the metaphor of flames, out of this, and let's just talk about the fact that when I am ontologically rooted to you, and if I don't treat you as a sister and a brother, if I'm not a friend to the earth, If I like St. Paul don't see everybody as better than I am, and I mean everybody humbly is better than I am, then I have not got the light of the Holy Spirit with me at that moment. So again, what's the overall organic understanding of the gospel in Jesus Christ? You know it and I know it. It's unconditional, it's love, it's compassion, it's forgiveness, and that's the whole ball game. Right? It's like trying to say Paul's a legalist just because you read Romans 13:4, right? No, he's not. Okay. And so I would say, whenever I read a gospel passage such as that, I say, yes, I am in hell, because I walk past homeless people every day. I take the subway every day, and I look in the subway, and if there's 8 or 10 homeless people and a place stinks to high heaven, I go to the next car. Well, what does that say about me? It says I'm in hell. I'm already in the flames. So there's my 5-cent interpretation of Dives and Lazarus.
Cecelia, David Christian asks, surely ancient punishments were often less respectful of the prisoner's humanity, whether stoning, crucifixion, or all sorts of other forms of shaming and retribution. Isn't our system admittedly full of faults an effort to move away from that inhumanity? And doesn't Christian ethics deserve some sort of credit for it?
So Andrew, I think maybe we'll give different answers on this. I will say, my long ago and far away in the days of my youth, my undergraduate degree was in medieval history. And I draw on that periodically when I'm teaching criminal law. And I know I always tell my students, well, there's, good news and bad news. Bad news is we have, 500,000 crimes now and many people in prison. The news from the past is that there were only 5 felonies. There were only 5 felonies in common law, I believe. Not very many, almost nothing was a crime. But oh, by the way, if you committed them, they're all capital. Yeah, I mean, I tend not to think that human nature changes that much across the generations. And one piece of human nature not changing is that we end up seeing that people don't live up to our ideals, right? And I think that the early Christian community, while very much committed to communitarianism and to generosity and to living the gospel fully, in very much the same way that many of us try to be today, right? We try to live as Jesus taught us, and we fail. And I don't think that that is a unique modern failure. The fact is, homicides have been high historically. Self-help, maybe not even through the legal system, but informal retribution, blood feuds. I mean, these things have persisted. Genocide across generations, across cultures, including Christian cultures, or at least nominally Christian cultures at various times. And so I guess I'm not persuaded that the lack of prisons necessarily meant a lack of punishment. I think, private domestic violence, which wasn't even recognized, right? So many things that we see today as deep harms were simply tolerated or ignored. And I think we have punished and we have harmed and we have hurt, both formally and informally, as crime and as sanction across time. And that there has been an effort to become kinder or gentler or more civilized, however you want to put it. Unfortunately, we have done so, as you expressed beautifully in portions of the book, by making punishment and pain less visible, right? We hide it behind the prison walls where we don't have to confront it, and we can live in the neat mythology that all is well and people are fine, when in fact there is deep suffering and deprivation in many of our institutions, and quite frankly, in many of our neighborhoods and communities as well. And we segregate ourselves so we don't have to see that. I saw in the comments people said, aren't we going to talk about racism and deprivation and injustice? And of course, those are key and core features of today's criminal justice system. And when you talk about less punishment and fewer people in prison, I do hope that as Christians, we can see that many of the excesses of today's system really do go beyond the bounds of, even if you believe in punishment, beyond the bounds of deserved and just punishment.
So Andrew, Father Dan Hartnett, my colleague at Loyola, loves your book. He says, wonderful talk, but he shares a little bit of Cecelia's skepticism. He says, most of us are more embedded in the logic of equivalence than we are in the gospel logic of gift, the logic of generosity and mercy, which presupposes a process of conversion, restoration, and reconciliation. And he asks, how do we bring about the much needed conversion, not only at the personal level, but at the social and institutional level?
It's a great question, Father. I'd like to hear your opinion on that one. I'm writing as a Catholic scholar, Father, and I'm writing as somebody, you can't tell it by looking at me. I know I'm very youthful, but I started going to jails and prisons at Marquette in 1970. So that, as my friends tell me, that makes me a lifer. And I've seen so much misery in the prisons, Father. I have seen so many wasted lives. I just can't believe how many people have suffered. Cecelia, and they say you're absolutely right. You know, pain and punishment are the hidden part of this whole deal. So, Father, I don't know as a nation. I don't know how we can change our history, how we can change our language, how the dominant discourse is so divisive. You know that. Everybody who's listening knows that. We can't even appreciate each other as human beings, and we share the same nation, the same quote set of core values, and we can't see any decency in ourselves. I don't know how America is going to become better. All I know is God's at work, and I want God to work through the church, and I want us to be the church. And I'll be frank, and I'm so glad and honored to you, Tom, and to Michael for inviting me. It's such an honor to be here to inaugurate this conversation about Catholic criminal justice. But I want to save the church, and I'm worried. I'm worried that, as I say, it took us 20 centuries to give up torture and the death penalty. And I'm saying now, let's not take another century to give up punishment and prison. Let's lead by example with the gift of the Holy Spirit, with the power of Jesus Christ that resides in everything and everyone. And let us stand up and shout from the housetops, open up the prison doors. There's different ways to treat people, but nobody should ever be harmed. So will the nation go along with that, Father? Frankly, I doubt it. But I have a little more hope for the church. And that's what I want to work with.
So speaking of the church, Cecelia, Stephen Renberg quotes Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And the quote is, the church is only the church if it exists for others. And Stephen says, the incarcerated, the poor, the oppressed are the others. Does the church need to put more emphasis on our obligation to the others? Are we as a church, the Catholic Church, in need of the conversion that Andrew talks about?
Of course we are. All of us as people and the church collectively. It's so comfortable, but the Catholic tradition is so rich. You can find so much truth and so much beauty and so much reflection on all the subtleties and challenges of human existence in our traditions. It's really spectacular. And there is such a temptation to rest in a little bit of self-righteous pride that we know all the things and have figured out all the things. And therefore, it's good enough to live maybe a mildly sacramental life and be nice to the people around us and attend only to those within our circle. And that, of course, is not, in fact, what Jesus did. It's not what the gospel calls us to. And it's not, in fact, what the riches of our tradition say we ought to be doing. I really firmly believe that the only answer to many of the ills, all of the ills we have, is relationship and communion, particularly with the poor and marginalized. Amen. That's the way Jesus lived. That the church tells us in all things, both policy and in our lives, right? We are to give preferential option to the poor. We are to seek out the good for the least of us. We're to protect the marginalized, the orphan, the widow, the imprisoned, right? These are the works of mercy. These are the things we are called to do. And yet, so many of us live in silos, protected spaces, where we imagine the poor through media, through books, through stories. We don't have deep and ongoing relationships with people whose lives are complicated. And it's only when we are living with and in communion with those who are on the margins that we ourselves can be challenged to grow and to understand and to begin changing our understanding of behaviors and penalties that are appropriate. And I think the church can do this in millions of ways. I mean, certainly there are wonderful works being done by Catholic charities, by some of the ministries that I know are co-sponsoring tonight's program. There are many examples of people doing this work, but it is by far not the majority of the people we see in the pews on Sunday, right? Pre or post-COVID. And I think that there are many things that we can do as a community to open our hearts, open our doors, open our lives to those on the margins and take our lead from parishes and ministries that are doing just that. And that's really where the conversion happens, right? It's in us, the change in us that changes the way we see people, we treat people, we sentence people, we carry out punishment, and maybe most importantly for lay people, the way we reintegrate those with criminal records back into our communities and our lives.
What a wonderful way to close our webinar this evening. And I want to thank Cecelia Klingele and Andrew for a wonderful 1 hour of very stimulating conversation and thoughts, and turn things back over to Michael.
Well, let me just echo the judge's gratitude to our panel, and especially extend our thanks to you, Professor Skotnicki, for bringing this text to us that has spurred on such reflection. But a special word of gratitude to Tom for not only pulling this event together, but really being the driving force behind launching this Catholic Criminal Justice Reform Network. We'd invite you to stay tuned, join our mailing list. It's a great way for you to see what upcoming events we have going on, but also our upcoming issue of our newsletter, our print newsletter, The Beacon, will have a story on the Catholic Criminal Justice Reform Network and some of its goals. So a wonderful way for you to stay informed. And thank you for joining us tonight. You can register today for the next event that's a part of this series on April 8th. Just take a look for that in the chat, where we're going to be turning our eye to the courts and the role that the courts have played, particularly the Supreme Court, in helping to amplify our mass incarceration problem. This event was organized tonight by the Lumen Christi Institute, but also joined with a number of co-sponsors: the Catholic Lawyers Guild of Chicago, the Boston College Law School, the University of St. Thomas School of Law, Colby House Jail Ministry, St. Paul's Catholic University Center, the Collegium Institute's Legal Humanities Project, the National Center for the Laity, American Media, and Oxford University Press. Just a word of gratitude to each of these sponsors who've helped ensure the success of this event. And finally, I invite you to help ensure the success of future events. Help get word out to your friends and parishes, or follow us on social media and share our materials. Join our mailing list today, including just for our weekly newsletter, a great way to see what is up in store for us. And finally, you can become a financial supporter of our work today by donating at www.lumenchristi.org/donate to help us to ensure that we can continue to provide great programs like these for free to audiences like you. I hope you have a blessed week, and we look forward to when you can tune in again for our programs. Thank you so much, and God bless.